ways of approaching situations, or at least different ways from the ways that scientists and engineers and designers and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and politicians and other people approach situations, particularly complex systems and complex problems. And that's because we tend to think by making. We think with our hands and our eyes and our ears, or we're dancers with our bodies. So we develop different kinds of knowledge than other people do. Andrew calls this qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research of the kind that, say, social scientists tend to do. It's qualitative. It's often quite subjective in nature. And with this basic insight, Andrew's developing a framework for teaching artists how to work with people and organizations in other fields outside the arts, so we can have impact in the world, not only through our artwork that might get exhibited in museums and galleries, or even presented publicly in different ways, but often by embedding ourselves and collaborating with teams in other kinds of organizations outside the art world, which I just think is a really fascinating possibility. It's a set of questions that's come up again and again in colloquia. What is the impact of our work, and how can we be artists and responsive and engaged citizens at the same time. Andrew's practice has included media production and strategic design for USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's produced 2 nationally broadcast award-winning feature documentaries. He's produced and done research with an experimental off-Broadway gender-reverse re-performance of the Trump-Clinton debates. And as an educator, he's taught art, film, and media within and also outside many different institutions, including SVA, the Rhode Island School of Design, Pratt, and schools in Haiti, Bangladesh, and Ghana. He's also worked as a camera operator and as an impact producer, and in lots of different capacities around documentary film and media production. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Freiband.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you everybody for having me. And yeah, so as it's made clear in the introduction, I don't exactly know what it is I do. When people ask me, it's a little depends on the day. But so I want to speed through a kind of introduction of this work as quickly as I can, so that we can get to the dialogue and the questions. The last thing that any of our educational institutions need is another long lecture from a white man. When I fully believe, as Paulo Freire says, dialogue is revolutionary action, which is what we need now. So I look forward to your questions, to engaging with you, to listening and learning, which is very much at the heart of what I understand arts literacies to be. Mark covered my kind of career arc, and a lot of that has been searching for purpose, a sense that artists wield some kind of really incredible power, but we don't really know how to wield it. And I certainly don't feel that I've been a part of educational institutions that taught me how to wield it effectively. And so part of what I've done has made myself a bit of an academic in exile, and I went and started my own art school, so to speak, or what I prefer to call as a school for artists. Once you're already an artist, this is professional development. It's a post-bac kind of program where I can work with artists individually, we can work in small groups, and really learn a vocabulary for how do we activate and catalyze what artists do. The premise of it is that art is research. Rather than think about the art objects and the artworks themselves, it's the act of making art that is an act of learning. So I pose this question to start. Can everyone hear me? Okay, yeah. Then I'll start pacing, which is good because it keeps me at the podium. That's important. So I pose this question, which is, what do artists do? Which seems like a very simple question, but might not be one that we ask because it's so obvious. And just a few days ago, I was actually giving a similar talk to a room full of environmental science students at Cornell, and I posed this question, and of course they were like, well, I don't know, they make art. And I posed them this question, and I asked them, well, do you make science? And they don't, right? They understand what they do as an act of learning. Science is research, science is gathering data about the world around them, and synthesizing it into knowledge that can be applied in applied science becomes technology. So I've been thinking about, well, if art is not just making art, which is what we are kind of taught it is, then what is it? What are we actually doing? And then beyond that, what is applied art? Right? What is the kind of the application of the knowledge that we synthesize when we work as artists? So this isn't a really new question. This is a pretty old question. That art and science have been related to each other for a really long time, and we're cousins in many ways. And then this one, this relationship between art and science cuts across cultures, it cuts across societies. And then I kind of mapped it out when I was thinking about this as this kind of series of schisms in the way that we produce knowledge, particularly in the West. So if once we were all natural philosophers in this room could have been artists and scientists, and without differentiating between those ways of learning, the Enlightenment gave us this schism between science and art, where the empirical method started to break the world apart into smaller and smaller constituent pieces. And artists reacted against that with Romanticism, because at the time the science was really bad. It was a good idea, but they weren't coming up with very good explanations for the world. The method was useful. The results were very crass. And so artists and the faith communities started to ask, well, what about the soul? What about the spirit? What about the ineffable? What about the things that fall in between the atoms? And then we had modernism, which became the schism between art and religion. And now we as artists often sit in this relegated position relative to the rest of our society. Some of us romanticize that as outsiders, right? It's not unusual for the artist to be the weird kid in the class, and then you all come to art school and here are all the weird kids. But that kind of relegation is actually a serious form of oppression for our form of knowledge, right? Because all of a sudden, when we enter the professional world, we can't get back into that kind of legitimate space that scientists and engineers and technologists enjoy. When the artist comes in for the artist residency, nobody knows what that artist is going to do. They expect them just to do the weird kid things. And we reinforce that for ourselves. So what is it that artists actually produce? If we ask capitalism, it's art. It's the objects of our production, the things that we physically make. It's the films and photographs and paintings and sculptures that we make. I'm calling them primary texts here because I'll come back to a point where if we can think about art as texts, that it gives us another way of looking at them and a way that we can process them and interpret them. So this idea of art as the primary output of artists' labor is, of course, a wealth factory. And it's the wealth factory that the rising inequality, the exorbitant inequality that we live in today, is a direct result of. This quote by Larry Fink, which is well circulated, that there are only two things that store wealth, which is contemporary art and real estate. It's no mistake that Steve Nugent and Donald Trump sit in these positions of power today. And of course, why does that work? Why is art so valuable? It's because it has an effect on an audience. And that effect can be monetized. Okay? So we make art so that we can touch people, contact people, have a relationship with an audience, affect people, express things to people, interpret the world for people, reflect the world that we see for other people. And that relationship between the artist and the audience is one that has been capitalized. And we do so because we need to make a living. Okay, and again, we are kind of caught in this cycle of reinforcing this habit where we have to be sustainable, right? We can't graduate from art school, we can't be an artist and not have a career because, like it or not, we live in this kind of market economy, this commodity economy. So things have to be sustainable. But we don't ever ask ourselves where that term comes from. It's an ecological term. It's not an economic term. Organisms live and die. They don't sustain. Sustainability comes from an ecosystem staying alive. And so what if an institution just lived and died when it ran out of its use? What if you start a business and it wasn't sustainable and it just failed? But you did good work in the meantime. We can think of ourselves as artists in the same way. And that starts to help us think about how do we break away from these kind of self-oppressing concepts of how we exist in the market. All of this was coming to me when I was given these opportunities as a filmmaker to start working with USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development. Each of us has some opportunity like this come across in our lives. This is how artists sustain themselves. You're commissioned to make a film. In my case, you might be commissioned to make paintings, take photographs, do portraits. It's the things that we do to make money on the side while we have our idealized art practice in this other part of our lives. And we all, maybe some of us are able to meld those together. But in my case, I was doing this work and thinking like, well, what's the purpose of this? I'm a communicator for this agency. I didn't mind the work that they did, and I thought the mission was on target, but it's an enormous bureaucracy, and they miss a lot of things. But this is where artists find themselves. You're instrumentalized at some point in your career for your skills, for the craft, right? Your ability to make a film. So these aren't really my films, but I still made them, which is an unusual relationship to have with your work. While I'm doing this work, and this is true again, I think, of artists in any discipline, while you're doing that work, it's really hard to shut off your artist's intuition. And so what I'm doing here is I did work in Haiti, for example, on steep hillside agriculture, which I don't know anything about. I did work, in this case, on ivory animal poaching in East Africa, which again, I don't know anything about. But I started to get this hunch that each time I was asked to make a film about a big complex system with lots of moving parts, what I was doing was following a very particular intuitive pathway. And I thought of that as perceived causation. I'm trying to tell a story. A story only makes sense if my audience sees causation. And so I started to think maybe perceived causation is another way of thinking about narrative. And maybe as a filmmaker, I have developed a kind of cultivated literacy, an ability to read and write in narrative that nobody else in this context had. They never connected dots based on story before. And so I started to think, well, that's like a really unique way of learning. And as I was doing this work, I kept having this experience of making these films, carrying my camera through these, far-flung contexts that I really was foreign to and alien to and not knowing anything about. And I would have these experts following along with me, helping guide the pathway. Maybe they work for the embassy, maybe they work for the African Wildlife Foundation. And each time we would go to a new location based on an interview that I had given or an answer I had heard or a process that I wanted to film because it was gonna help me tell the story. Those experts were like, I've never known, I didn't make that connection ever before. I didn't know that these phenomena had anything to do with each other. I didn't know that this person knew that person. I didn't know that this system was connected to that system. So their modes of research, the way that they understood the systems were highly quantitative. They used a lot of big data. They used very conventional social science methodologies like surveying and interviewing and field studies. And those are good methods, but those methods have gaps. They left gaps. Telling a story about the system and making a film about the system was a way for me to fill these gaps. So I thought filmmaking is research. What if I could actually get other people to value it that way? Narrative is information. This is a kind of qualitative data that I have access to through my training and intuition that these big players on big playing fields needed to be able to do their work better. And I thought it was important work. So then I began to question exactly what it is. How do I have this literacy? Where does this literacy come from? And I wanted to break apart the process I go through as a filmmaker when I start to look at a film frame and when I start to look at film scenes. So any of us who are visually literate have some form of this process taking place, which is we very quickly scan an image, and we scan all these things based on things we already know, things we don't know, things that we carry in from our own life experience, and things that we carry in from the previous scene. So these are all these different modes of knowing and knowledge that are embedded and implicit in any film scene. This is the logic process of watching a film or looking at an image. So in one image, there's external knowledge, there's knowledge created within the frame, and there's the temporal knowledge created by the sequence. And film is complex because there are multiple shots. So each time you start to connect clips, you start to create this accumulative form of knowledge. So film is this really incredible knowledge-producing machine. Most filmmakers tend to work intuitively. So they go through this process and they go through it iteratively in the editing room. They're thinking about, well, this works and this doesn't work, this works and this doesn't work. They show it to an audience, they get some feedback. But they're relying on an instinct that's rooted in this kind of knowledge production. So if you've ever opened up Adobe Premiere or you've done any video editing work yourself, you'll recognize that a film timeline is represented in this linear way. Okay, so our job is to connect the clips in the most causative or pleasing way in order to either tell the story we want or create the visual effect or the affective experience that we want our audience to have. Fundamentally, it's a straight line. And that straight line is defined by the editor or defined by the director, defined by the vision of the artist. Most of the time, there's an agenda to that story. That agenda is driven by the market. Again, the director, the editor are forced by the market, by the idea that their product is the most important thing they have to make into fitting a particular story together. But we all know that when we make a decision, we make that decision based on a lot of factors. When we see something happen in the world, it's because of a lot of factors. So there are a lot of narratives that are interlocking. And I wanted to know what it would look like if every decision that was made in the course of one of those timelines could be linked up to causes and effects, and to varying degrees of causation. Thinking about a narrative map, right? A multiplicity of narratives. So why do I call it, so this is what I see narrative literacy research potentially looking like. Working for USAID or some other organization like that that's got a big complex system to solve. And they hire a filmmaker, they hire a narrative artist of some kind to come in and just tell stories about that system. And then instead of just making linear films, creating a map that other kinds of experts can navigate that system through. So why is it literacy? I call it a literacy because it's got to go both ways. Anyone in this room can watch a film. Not anyone necessarily can make one. We're technically illiterate if we can only identify the symbols and not rewrite in that language. Again, and I felt every artist has some kind of fundamental literacy. It doesn't always have to be about words. It can be narrative. It can be purpose, worth, affect. There are ones that I'm kind of uncovering new ones with every artist that we work with. And it all comes down to this process of asking artists, what do you know, and how do you know it? So I have been doing this work in narrative and thinking, well, there's something much bigger here, which is all artists, all these other disciplines. And I wanted to start working with other disciplines, understand how do other artists know, and how do other artists know what they know. And so that's when I kind of left conventional teaching and started Artist Literacies Institute and started working in small work groups to just interrogate artists, have dialogue with artists in this way. What do you know and how do you know it? And going back to this idea that artists are producing art, and that's where we begin. And then we start to look at what are the effects of that art and these audience texts that exist out there, the responses that audiences have to your work. There's data there, right? And often it's data that we ignore. Maybe we don't want to know what the reviews are. Maybe we don't care what people's responses are. There's all kinds of different stances to the audience texts, the responses, the reviews, the observations of viewers in a gallery. And then looking at what I think is maybe the most important part of our work, which is the process of getting to that artwork. All of the peripheral texts, all of our sketchbooks, all of our memos, all of our ideas, everything that leads up to the object itself, to the art object, creates this cycle, this dynamic cycle of the artistic process. Every review you read is going to affect your next iteration, your sketches, your ideas, your drafts. Those, of course, form the primary texts, which is what the public sees. The public sees them, those things then feed back in. And then there are these kind of secondary cycles where previous work informs our current work. Our current work may connect directly to our audience, certainly in like a social media, kind of hyper-shortened cycle where you're posting sketches, right? But they're not finished works. But you're opening up your process to public review. So with this cycle in place, each one of these bodies of texts, each one of these texts becomes something that we can code, right? So using a social science term, coding is the process of going through and highlighting language from a text, identifying metaphors, identifying frames of thought, identifying particular keywords, so that we can see patterns in it. And if we were to code, and we can code visually, it doesn't have to be entirely language-based, but if we could code each of these, we start to see the patterns that emerge. And within those patterns are the kinds of data that we're crunching as artists, often unconsciously, often intuitively. Importantly, this. So data doesn't count as knowledge, right? Data exists outside of ourselves. Knowledge requires consciousness. And so we need the artist, and this is so important, I think, we need artists to synthesize that data. We need artists to produce knowledge from information. And that's really something that we do, I think, better than almost anybody else. And then I think about the enormous resources being invested in AI development to build brains that can help synthesize complexity. When we have this economically relegated population of some of the most brilliant people possible, all of our brains not necessarily leveraged to their fullest potential. So what about those other forms of artistic practice besides narrative? This is where the small work groups at Literacies Institute come in. So we just started these in the last year, bringing together artists. Doesn't matter what discipline you're in, doesn't matter what stage of your career you're in. And we have this dialogue. What do you know and how do you know it? We do some presentations on coding, some social science methodologies. We're borrowing things from all over the place, as artists are wont to do. Some people would look at it and say, well, it's not rigorous, it's not scientific. I don't know if you've talked to many scientists. It's exactly what scientists do as well, right? It's all borrowing, repurposing, figuring things out, and it all comes down to that last question, does it work? For scientists, it's simple. If it works, the thing turns on, right? The technology, the applied method turns on. But we've looked at a couple centuries of really bad science, and it hasn't turned people off from valuing science very highly. So I've got sculptors who are examining social dynamics in looking at videos of performances and then using these producer texts to really kind of code and understand how people interact with each other, and then mapping that against a sculptor's intuition for spatial dynamics and movement and flow. I'm working with actors who, as Mark mentioned in the introduction, one of the projects was a gender-reversed reproduction of the Trump-Clinton debates. Actors and performing artists' ability to embody other people and swap their genders, change their age, change their race, create engines for identifying bias in audiences that are really effective. And so the Freiband Performance Lab has been doing work where they take highly recognizable media objects like the Kavanaugh hearings here, and actors will memorize every gesture, breath, cadence of speech, body movement. They replicate the camera angles, and then they reproduce the Kavanaugh hearings with gender, age, and race reversals. And then do nothing other than show them to people and ask people, what do you know now that you didn't know before? When there's language coding involved, social science methods do get applied, and so I'm working with social scientists to better understand how these methods, what the flaws in these methods are, and then how they can be applied in experimental ways, like with a choreographer who is also a city demographer, trying to understand how her intuitions for the movement of populations and neighborhoods also relates to the movement of bodies and sensory experience. So through this dialogue, through these, this kind of drawing out of the codes and patterns in these three aspects of our artistic process, we develop interventions, applications, and experiments that let the artists gather more data. And once artists identify their literacy, and in the case of an artist like Big Virgin, who is talking about purpose and worth in bureaucratic hierarchy, suddenly this sign becomes something that you can look for, and you can map and measure in new ways. And all of a sudden, this artist has a new value as a researcher to an organization that, again, is missing something intangible in the other ways that they evaluate themselves. So everybody wants to change the world, all right? And this is instrumentalization part 2. How do we apply this work? How do we get artists engaged in working with organizations or institutions, NGOs, nonprofits, community groups, governments, anything, any kind of institution you can think of? How do we get artists there without losing what makes art unique, without over-instrumentalizing it? And we are in this very late kind of neoliberal age where we each want to make an impact. We each want to change the world individually. I started thinking about, narratively, like, what does impact look like? What does change making look like? If each of us as an individual, we have a few forces at our disposal, and there are a million individuals around us, and we're trying to apply those forces on multiple individuals at once. Jorge Mendez-Blake did it much more elegantly, I thought, by showing how a copy of Kafka's The Castle creates a ripple. And I think this is a really, kind of eloquent metaphor for the kind of change that artists can affect. First, we have to be comfortable with increments, but we also have to be firm and not compromising. So there is instrumentalization, which is kind of becoming the sort of artist that all these other organizations and structures want us to be, what USAID needed from me to be a professional communicator on their behalf and take their data and present it to a public. Or can we put artists in these places and have those places identify a new value in what they do, in those ineffable and poetic and intangible things that artists bring? Part of that is on us as artists, to have a vocabulary for the ineffable that is also rigorous, which may sound like a contradiction, but it's just a matter of not having the words for it. We just don't teach it, and we don't learn it. So some of the instrumentalizations that are out there, and these are not necessarily negative things entirely, these are essential roles, but this is often where artists land and don't know how to go beyond. STEM to STEAM initiatives, I don't know if you guys are familiar with STEM to STEAM, the insertion of the A for art into science, technology, engineering, and math. I've done STEM to STEAM stuff. Can you do our website for us? Can you do some data visualizations for us? We've got all the data, right? The scientists do the data, the artists make it pretty. Activism, right? This is a time for activism. What's beyond that, okay? Most of the activism that artists get engaged in, again, is communications-based. We make the posters, we decorate, we create images, we create memes. Those are important things. What's beyond it, right? What are we learning in that process of making the memes that might have deeper value in actually altering the social structures that we're railing against? Data visualization, communications, and then of course, the contemporary art market, right? Well, so this is the wealth farm for the already rich. Every time we engage with it, okay, we are drawn into kind of capitalism's lure. But the fact is that the value that you produce for yourself is going to be a fragment a fraction of the value that you're producing for somebody else who knows how to leverage what it is you make. So this is this as an issue is a good place to start. This is a big one. The earth is getting hotter. We've got a few years to do anything about it. And this is a point where a lot of artists that I work with feel this incredible sense of impotence, irrelevance. How can we do anything? And they say, all right, I'm gonna organize another march. I'm gonna organize another work group. But if we think about, and again, going back to this conversation that I just had with a room full of scientists, I said, you guys have given us all the evidence in the world, and still nothing's changed. It's not a question of resources. The carbon is out there. It's going to be out there, okay? And it's going to be there when we're gone, and the earth really doesn't care. It's an issue of relationships. It's our relationship to the earth, it's our relationship to each other, it's our relationship to this issue. And artists have a huge amount of influence over human relationships. We can affect change in terms of how people relate to each other because that's the language that we speak in. Right? All of our data is qualitative. That is, it has a quality for human beings. And so the center of our attention in Artist Literacies Institute is on your process. The nice thing about artistic processes is that artworks spin off of them automatically. If you are making art, if you're engaged in a creative practice, art will happen. Right? Focusing on art isn't necessary; it will come. But if we zero in on our process, then other things can happen too. We'll learn about the world. We're conducting research. We're scientists. So just now kind of catch up to some of what we're doing now at Artist Literacies Institute. So I talked about the performing artists that I've been working with at the Freiband Performance Lab. So we're trying to tackle the 2020 elections and democracy generally. And so this is a project where we hold debates, or rather table readings of policy statements by the Democratic candidate for president. And we use actors to randomly swap genders, ages, and races, and then we poll the audience before and after the process. And so we've held several of these now in a row. Every time it's, Bernie Sanders is a different body, is a different gender, is a different race. And when Bernie Sanders speaks about immigration and Bernie Sanders speaks about gender reproductive rights, the audience that may be made up of Bernie Sanders supporters doesn't recognize him. And so what this suggests is that the audiences, voting audiences, are not as critically aware of why they're making political choices as they may think. That's kind of what we would expect a spectacle political process to generate. So we have these table reads. We have, it's not a theater performance. It's 35 minutes of actors reading these. And again, in a verbatim methodology, which is per word, per breath. And they're able to match the cadence and rhythm of the candidates pretty specifically. What's remarkable is that they're still recognizable, but people cannot look past, as is often the case, their body, who they're inhabiting. And so you see, in the first case, we saw, Andrew Yang's support drop when he became a young white woman. We saw Bernie Sanders' support drop significantly when he became a young white woman. We saw Beto O'Rourke become very popular when he became a middle-aged white woman. And the audience, again, had expressed its preferences by saying we prefer Sanders and we prefer Warren, and yet things shifted significantly. So right now we're in the middle of a scientific experiment, a research experiment, of which we have 2 or 3 data points, and what we're starting to see are trends in things like a liberal bias against youth, certainly a liberal bias against women, and it still doesn't hurt to be a white man in politics. And so last, the plug is that Thursday, we're having the 3rd one, right over here at CSI. So you can grab that if you want to come out and see how it works in person. It's 35 minutes of table read, and then you all get a worksheet. Everybody participates. We use your notes anonymously as our qualitative data, as our process and producer texts. And then we end up with reports that we're now trying to then connect to these bigger platforms that are talking about resilience and democracy, connecting to media platforms, connecting to political science, academic institutions. And the point being that we are meant to be that kind of book under the brick wall, but making sure that we see the effects rise all the way up to the top. That was quick, that was a lot. That way we get to the fun part, which is actually hearing from you and talking more. So thank you all for your attention.
So I'm going to kind of do this a little bit how we did the event with Marilyn Minter. So Andrew and I will converse for a few minutes and then open it up to questions from you. So you did cover a lot of ground, and the main question in my mind right now that I think a lot of the students and others in the audience may have in their minds is, how would I put this into practice myself?
Good question. So, you don't work alone. One of the things that I kind of skimmed over that we had talked about a little bit was the idea of Literacies Institute as what we call an impact producer for artists. So it's it's an enormous process for artists to kind of go through and figure out, what's my artist's literacy? Like, what's my unique form of qualitative data that I generate when I make work? And we do try and do everything ourselves. Again, I think that's an ethos that was really drilled into me during art school. It's like you're supposed to be able to accomplish a lot by yourself. There is rhetoric around collaboration and community building, but I think that's actually gotten better in my experience with students these days. That's much more genuine. It used to just be kind of talk, but really do it by myself. So ALI is there to be a place where artists can kind of come together and say, hey, I want to find out what my artist's literacy is. And then I want a kind of backstop to help do some of that analysis and processing. Like, I'll say, let's look at your sketches and your drafts and the iterations of your work. And then, once we identify what the literacy is, then I want ALI to be able to serve as a kind of agency that can then think vertically and strategically. Well, you should work with Planned Parenthood, you should work with National Resources Defense Council, you should work with this media organization, and cultivate the kinds of artist residencies that can be meaningful, and not just you get a cubicle in an office space or a studio in an unusual place. So it's meant to really take artists through that whole process to find applications that are meaningful for the artist's practice. So I don't want to work for this organization, and then we're not going to create that opportunity for you. But it's a kind of feedback system for strategic thinking.
So one outcome might be artists to set up residencies of different kinds, but when this audience thinks of a residency program or an artist in residence program, it's usually you get some studio space, maybe it's out in the country somewhere, maybe meals are provided if you're lucky, maybe they'll invite curators and gallerists and artists to come through and do studio visits. That's what artist residencies usually look like. I know there's also a history of having artists in residence at places like Bell Labs. In fact, there's a new museum in Rhizome are doing a collaboration with Bell Labs right now, facilitating, injecting artists into a place where engineers usually work. What are some other kinds of examples of artists being in residence in places where people are working on solving problems or making things or doing other kinds of research?
I think it's mostly in those places where there isn't really a difference, there's no differentiation between artists, engineers, technologists, and scientists. Xerox Park, that kind of thing, where they're like, we don't know, we're going to have artists here, we're going to have, this was the countercultural idea, let's bring everybody together. And then artists were a part of those conversations, hire artists and trust them, right? Which is, nobody can do that anymore, right? We have to have deliverables, right? There has to be outcomes and evidence in order for people to put money on an artist residency. And the other problem, again, speaking from my experience, is a sense among artists that they aren't qualified to go to some really high level places. You know, this sort of like split mentality of the artist is often that, well, you know, I don't want to work for USAID. Like that was a response that a lot of people talked about, you know, had at some of the institutions I was working at. We don't want to work with government. We don't want to like soil our good name by engaging in this thing that's like a part of the real world. And then beneath that, I sensed we don't know what we're talking about. Like we're afraid to get into that room with economists because that's science, right? It's not science. It's art. It's the same thing. It's people just like testing stuff out to see, like throwing it against the wall, seeing what works, and then declaring it rigorous when it does. So it's like this superiority inferiority complex, and I feel like part of it is on us as artists. The best residencies, you know, are like UCLA, right, at sanitation department.
So, you guys familiar with Meryl Laderman-Euclides? She's a New York-based artist who, in the mid-70s,
Just said I'm doing this.
right,
Yeah.
so she decided to appoint herself the artist in residence at the New York City Department of Sanitation, people who collect the trash and haul it away. And over a period of years, that grew into various different projects, right?
Yeah, so she did 20, 30 years going on. So there are several outcomes of that. One is that, so this is an artist who said, I'm now your artist in residence, right? So that was, again, like an artist kind of insisting, I have value here, you need me. Okay, we don't know what. One early project was shaking the hands of every sanitation worker.
See, so that's worth just taking a pause on. So there's how many sanitation workers in New York? Let's just pick a number, make it 8,000. So one thing about sanitation workers is they handle garbage. Their hands presumably are dirty. And what she decided to do was to shake the hand of every single one of those, say it's 8,000 workers, partly as a gesture of, you know, these people aren't contaminated. Partly, I think it could be read in lots of ways as a way of saying thank you for your important work for the city, acknowledging their humanity, right? It could be read in a whole bunch of different ways, but it was kind of like a durational, participatory, socially engaged, interactive performance project.
Yeah. And then 30 years down the road, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but in the social imaginary of New York, the sanitation department like has a certain cachet, you know? It's like firefighters or heroes, cops or whatever, you know, we want them to be. Garbage man, like, there's something heroic about that. That wasn't always the case, you know? Like, what that did was kind of undermine almost a caste system of, you know, of public service workers, because the sanitation department has art shows. Right?
And so that, and that effect might be at a kind of substructural, almost unconscious level, like in the way you showed that image of Franz Kafka's The Castle being placed underneath this brick wall and having this effect of, you know, really raising the profile of the wall, you know, 20 generations of bricks. So there's bricks later. It's interesting.
And so now New York City has its public arts and residence program, which is directly connected to the success of Liz' insistence that she's going to be part. So now I think it's 4 or 5 annual residencies given by the city Department of Cultural Affairs to embed an artist in an agency that is pre-selected by the city. So one thing that I'm working with a couple of the artists in residence and have called pairs, public arts in residence. So Laura Nova is embedded at the Department for the Aging. And, you know, has expressed a lot of the same sentiments. You're saying, well, you know, it's like you get a few $1,000s for the year, you get a cubicle, but I want to change the world. I want to create that rippling effect. I want something to be transformed. And she sits in there, she listens to people on the phone all day, right? So the work that we're trying to do is, well, how do you learn? How do you know what you know? Trying to understand what is your qualitative data type, thinking yourself as a researcher, elevating the value in that space. And just first getting the artist over the inferiority complex, then that spreads to the context around the offense to say, well, this person really seems to hold themselves in high esteem. and is generating really interesting information for us. And with the scientists, I had this slide that talks about how when scientists and artists work together, often an artist, and I showed the Hans Hock, some of the Hans Hock stuff in the museum, like there's fabric on the fan. And the scientists look at the ripples in the fabric and they're like, oh yeah, there's, like I know there's data, I know what that data is, like wave dynamics, fluids, I get all that, that's, and the artist is just like, well, I just synthesized it first, right? Like I just saw the cool thing, I synthesized it intuitively, I made the cool thing. And so the relationship between science and art is often like the artist just does the synthesis by skipping through a lot of intuitive processes. And the scientists, if kind of given a vocabulary for it, say, oh wow, there's data in your artwork. I mean, that's a great experiment. I want to draw the data out of it.
Let me just pause and unpack the reference you just made for people in the audience who may not know. So there's a German-American artist named Hans Hocke, that's how it's usually pronounced. And he currently has a major solo retrospective exhibition at the New Museum of Contemporary Art on the Bowery. Just opened, I think.
Yeah.
The piece that Andrew is referring to is one that is, I think, more visual and lyrical than much of his work, where he placed a large sheet of silk on the floor of the gallery, and then there are one or maybe multiple fans at one end that simply blow air underneath the silk, and it flutters in these beautiful wave patterns. It's just really simple and beautiful. One of the pieces he's best known for was one, I think it's called Shapolsky Real Estate Holdings et al. Or something like that. Basically, Hans Hocke was invited to participate in a major museum exhibition, maybe at the Guggenheim Museum. I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but I think he investigated the financial relationship between someone on the board of trustees of the museum and a real estate slumlord, a real estate investor who owned a lot of buildings in poor neighborhoods and didn't take care of them very well, and basically extracted money from poor people in a neighborhood. Is that more or less correct? And so the piece takes the form of this kind of informational display showing all these financial relationships, and there's a lot of text and numbers and a few grainy black and white photographs. A far cry from the lyrical silk flowing on the floor. And this work, I think, was removed from the exhibition, censored.
Never permitted. Yeah.
Never permitted. And so in being censored, of course, it got a lot of attention, and people came to his defense, and in a certain sense, it had a much larger impact, showing the stupidity of institutions that try to censor work that criticizes them. It's similar. It's a really interesting precedent to forensic architecture's contribution to the Whitney Biennial, which was an investigation of this company called Safariland that manufactures tear gas canisters, and this is a company owned by one of the trustees of the Whitney Museum, and Maud, one of the students in this program, did a presentation on that today. So Hans Hocke is a really interesting example of an artist who has an explicitly research-based practice, who is producing what you call, or one might call, qualitative research.
Yeah.
Artist knowledge.
Some of it's quantitative too. He maps the address of all visitors to the show, to his gallery show, right? Yeah. And you go and you take a survey, about your age, your income level, political preferences. Yeah.
So he was associated with a movement known as institutional critique, precisely for this reason. And so in his case, the kind of institutional organization in which he was in residence, and for us as artists, we're often in residence in the art world, basically. So I'm actually in residence right now at this art school called SVA, right? And so are you, actually, although you're paying for it rather than getting paid. When you're
Which
invited,
is more common for residencies now.
right? Yeah, you pay to play, right? if you, where's an example? So Jay has an exhibition coming up at a space on Orchard Street. What's it called, Jay? What's this?
Space 84 Orchard Street.
Yeah. Right. So it's interesting. So you can think about that as you're being in residence there, and you're interfacing very briefly with this organization and institution, and producing not only an exhibition but possibly an intervention in that whole scene, right? So it's interesting to think about our responsibility as artists in all these different contexts, and we could then decide, okay, what other kinds of institutions or contexts would I want to, embed myself in, to use a journalistic term. So in the Iraq War, the U.S. military decided to allow artists to be embedded with troops, right? But then there were certain limits on them. So you can think of it as a residency. You can maybe think of it as being embedded, in a social science research team. I know an artist who his job is to be embedded at LinkedIn, which is kind of interesting. And like he gets to be an artist at LinkedIn and think like an artist and sort of hack what LinkedIn does.
But the thing that is tempting in those spaces is that institution has a gravity to it, has a pull to what you're going to do. Like, so what are you going to make while you're here, right? We're always asked what we're going to make while we're there. And if you say, well, knowledge, I'm just going to learn, I'm just going to sit here and watch, they're going to go, well, that's not much of a deliverable, right? We are spending money on you, so you need to produce something. And I think that's simply a point. That's just a point of resistance. Just no, something will come. I can't tell you what it is. And you wouldn't ask that of a research scientist.
Interestingly though, like when a museum says we'd like to exhibit your work, in fact we'd like you to make a new body of work for this show, and we'd like you to submit a proposal before we sign a contract, and the contract will involve then making 3 payments to you, one in advance, one when the project's halfway done, and one when it's complete. And so you have to say in advance what you're going to deliver.
Yeah.
So the point of resistance might be to say, no, museum, I'm not going to give you a proposal. You have to trust me. I'm going to produce knowledge.
Yeah.
But it could be a tough negotiation.
But we don't value ourselves on enough to do that.
Yeah, right.
We aren't taught to. Right? I mean, artists are taught to. We romanticize starving artists and struggling artists. It's like that's really a cool thing to be. That's a
To a certain extent, that's what this organization called Working Artists in the Greater Economy, WAGE, is all about, is insisting that artists, inviting artists to insist that they get paid to exhibit their work, especially in nonprofit organizations. I can't tell you how many museum shows, I won't make it about me, that artists are participating without getting paid a dime. In Canada, by law, nonprofit organizations and museums have to pay artists to exhibit their work. Artists have to get paid to screen their work, at a film festival. Not in the US, usually it's like, oh, thank you for the exposure, right? But getting back to, I want to encourage people to check out artist literacies, maybe participate in different ways, but I also want them to be able to walk away from tonight thinking, I can do this without Andrew.
Yeah.
Right. So in one helpful tool, so there's this missing link that I think for me when I was understanding your ideas that we drilled down on, that you touched base on really quick, which was the idea of an impact producer. The diagram that had the bubbles and the arrows on it, it talked about the art text, right? The thing that we made, the original text, the original source, the audience text, remember that bubble, which was basically like the effect it has on the audience, what audiences think about it, and then if asked what they might say about it, or how they might behave differently, you can think of that as an impact, right? And then there's the process, our process of making the thing that has the impact. And what we don't really have is a formalized way of getting that feedback, that text, from the audience. At least as visual artists. We get it in a program like this from our peers and from our faculty through critiques. But if you have a show out in the world, people come to the opening and they pat you on the back. You might get a review, but reviews are almost negative, almost never really critical these days. So it's almost like your work exists in a kind of void. People say, oh, how do people react? I have no idea how people into my work. All I know is from, when I maybe lurk in the gallery a little bit and see how people move around. But could you explain a little bit what an impact producer does for film?
Yeah.
And then how an impact producer might work in an art context, in a visual art context?
Yeah, so it's a job that was invented, largely emerged out of the social issue documentary movement in the last 10 to 20 years.
Social issue documentary movement?
There's a lot of social issue documentaries out there right now. Anyone can get a camera, anyone can make a film.
An example of that might be the films of Michael Moore. Are people familiar with
Yes,
that?
that would be, yeah.
Or Food Inc.
Food Inc.
I mean, there's a gazillion of them. I'm just trying to find ones that people might have heard of.
Yeah, no, all of them go right out of my head, because there's all these people looking at it right now.
Okay.
Go to Netflix, look up social issue.
Okay, so this impact producer role was invented when people started making more and more social issue documentaries, and they started to get picked up and distributed and be in bigger audiences.
Well,
And so people wanted to figure out what impact they were having.
Right, well, the problem is that documentaries are economically worthless, right? Because everyone can make them, and nobody goes to see them, right? So you put them out, they don't go to theaters. There aren't theaters, there are very, very few theaters. There are documentary film festivals that maybe a very few, like small elite population will go and see. People will seek out social issue documentaries, but it's very much a niche thing.
Well, so we think of social issue documentaries as having recently been successful, because I can name films like Food Inc. and Michael Moore's films that actually do get distribution, but you're saying that basically most of them never get seen except by other social issue documentary filmmakers.
So the good ones, so economically successful. So the good ones break even, right? That's like the best economic outcome is that you break even and you can go and make the next film. You're not making like Marvel movie money on social issue documentaries, and that's not why you make them. This isn't necessarily to say don't make social issue documentaries.
Sort of like contemporary art.
Yeah.
Best case scenario for most artists is you break even, pay your studio rent.
Yeah. So yeah.
One in 10 can do that.
So you spend $500,000, over a couple of years making a film. HBO, Showtime, Discovery Channel, whoever comes along, they buy it, PBS, and they buy it for, like, if you're lucky, what you spent on it. If not, a little bit less, and then you make some like educational sale. Anyway, so the competitive landscape of social issue documentaries, and when you're talking about the, I think, 8,000 entries into like Doc NYC for the 110 film slots. So it's a highly competitive landscape, and the competition is often premised on what kind of social impact is being made. It's not necessarily the merits of the film, the artistic merits of the film. It's like, is this an
That's
issue?
an example of what you call instrumentalization.
The instrumentalization is when you take that film and then you get it in front of the right people to create policy change, to create new advocacy groups or advocacy initiatives, and that's what an impact producer does. The impact producer is somebody that you hire on, you bring onto the film, usually just about when the film is done or after the film is done, and you say, we want this film to have meaning in the world. We didn't make it for nothing. We want a lot of change. We want people to become aware of an issue that they weren't aware of before. And so that's the impact producer's job. So they're very much like strategic designers. They develop a landscape approach to all the advocacy groups, NGOs, government agencies, academic experts around a specific social issue. They get the film into those places. They show it to the right people. They do social science surveying before and after to create metrics for how people's feelings have changed from the beginning of the film to the end of the film.
You told me a really helpful anecdote, a story about an experience you had as an impact producer on a film that you also executive produced, which was directed by our camera person tonight, Denali, called
Trey Mason Desan.
And what did you do as impact producer?
So Trey Mason Desan was a film about 3 boys who all each have an incarcerated parent.
Incarcerated means their dad's in jail?
Yes, dad or mom. And this was a look at just the experience of being a child with a parent in prison or recently out of prison, which is an enormous issue in this country. Again, one of these kind of under the radar issues. You've got millions and millions of kids, 1 in every classroom in America, statistically at least, have a parent in prison, and there's very little attention paid to it, whereas there's a lot of attention paid to other issues like, oh boy, your parents are veterans.
Just a side note, there's probably 2 countries in the world where you have millions and millions of kids whose parents are in jail. One is the United States, the other is China.
Yeah.
And just those are the 2 countries that are most represented in our audience.
Yeah. So it's a childhood trauma, right? I mean, this is a difficult way to grow up, and so this film just looks at this through the eyes of the kids. So it's a big issue, but again, how do you get this film to create impact? How do you get it to in front of the right people?
The film was profiles of 3 boys.
3 boys.
Whose dads were in jail.
Yeah. And it's a quiet, artful film. It's also not like, there's not a lot of interviews and experts, it's just like an experiential, participatory
You
film.
really get a sense of how having your dads in jail affected these boys in their childhoods and their emotional lives, their feelings.
So in this case, we wanted it to be a participatory process because the filmmaking was participatory. So the boys were where it began. We asked the boys, what do you think needs to change in the world? And those became the goals for the impact campaign. And once we had those goals, which was, it's like, well, there could be more awareness. It would be great if this wasn't a stigma. Like if schools across the country.
Stigma is like a shameful secret.
Yeah. Like schools across the country just acknowledge that a huge part of their school population is experiencing this, and that there were counselors present, and that there were peer groups present. Like that kind of thing can make a big change. And then working within the prisons as well. How does the way that the prisons facilitate visiting, how does that affect the relationship between a parent and a child? And so one of the discoveries of the film is that it is possible to be a good parent while you are incarcerated, but you need community, institutional, and structural supports around you to have that happen.
You told me an example of how you organized a screening of the film in a prison.
Yeah.
For prisoners who had kids on the outside. Prisoners had kids, and also for people who worked in the jail as administrators.
Yeah, like the educational, the educational department. So you're in prison. There are adult education programs, and those are people who work in a prison who are trying to make the incarcerated people's lives better and improve them.
So a key detail for me was that it's not just setting up the screening, but it's also that you attend the screening. Can you tell a little bit about how you observe the audience, how you measure the response, the impact?
So in this case, it's
how you elicit feedback.
It's a lot like making a documentary, right? I mean, again, that's because that's my literacy largely. It's very observational. So in this case, we were focusing on incarcerated populations and classroom and groups of kids. And so in the prison, this was at Metropolitan Detention Center here in down here in Brooklyn. When you go to Bed Bath & Beyond,
MDC.
you can miss it. Yeah. And it's eerie, like in the same structure as Bed Bath & Beyond now. There are 2,000 incarcerated parents behind this windowless wall. It's a federal facility, so someone's been there a really long time. So we went and showed the film to a room full of maybe 15, 20 men in this case, and sat in the back, watched people watch, and this is like a unique experience in the life of incarcerated men, to get to watch a movie, and to get to watch a movie that is like about their experience.
And their kids.
And their kids. Some of them see it for their experience as boys, like that was me as a boy. Some of them see it as parents, and some of them are seeing it both ways. But throughout the film, people are talking to each other, people are talking to the screen, people are laughing, people are crying. It's this evocation of emotion that's really effective. And so we're there, we're watching it, but then we also have the educational director there, who invited us in. And then we have like a little workshop, a little conversation that takes place, a talk back that takes place after. And the structure of that talk back tends to be story-based. What in this experience is like your own experience? Tell us a story.
So the whole audience participates in the talk back as one group, or do you break them up into subgroups?
If it's a small enough group at that size, we work with that group, yeah. It's like when it gets bigger, we'll break them up into small groups. And then we'll go through the same kind of structure, tell us a story. And what we found doing it multiple times was that there's a pattern to the story. The pattern is always the same. It's relation, like this was my experience, it was regret, here's what I've done wrong, here's what I regret, here's what I'm sorry for. It was the injustice, it's like this was bad, but I didn't deserve this. And then it was like redemption. Here's what I'm doing now that is making that I'm going to be a better father, or I'm going to be a better man. It's like this kind of cycle kept forming itself. That becomes the basis for a curriculum, right? So we can write that curriculum. This is how you do it without me, right? It's like, but we have to create a structure for, like, here's how impact actually works. Here's how people actually respond to the film. And now I can give that to the educational manager and say, here's a curriculum, and this is what we did. We developed a curriculum for classroom, we developed a curriculum for incarcerated audiences.
Curriculum is like an educational program.
Yeah.
It's a set of topics for discussion, a set of things people can talk about or read or look at.
Right. 10 questions you can ask, or 10 prompts, like do this activity. And that activity will have therapeutic benefits because we can measure those therapeutic benefits through qualitative measurement. Like this person has expressed they've had a better experience. If we are able to talk to them over a period of time, we can see that they are improving their relationship to their child. And then the institution at the same time sees benefits. So in a prison, one of the big issues is discipline, right? They're violent and dangerous places. There's evidence that shows that the more time incarcerated parents are allowed to spend with their children, the fewer disciplinary incidents they have. So actually letting people spend time with their kids, not surprising, but according to the carceral mindset, well, you're being punished, you're not allowed to see your kids. So they're going to be more violent, more angry, more dangerous, including for corrections officers and the people who work in the prison. And so the outcomes for everybody are worse. So here's a situation where just bringing the film, contextualizing it, and then not just letting them have a conversation, but actually showing them here's the shape of a therapeutic, beneficial conversation, and keep doing it, right? It's like this can kind of continue to work. I think that's the model for any kind of artwork. It's that you first want to see how people experience it, and then have that impact producer, that person there who is like, their job is just to evaluate people's responses to your work, and then come back to you as the creator and say, well, I think that we could achieve these goals. I think that we could achieve, if we create a curriculum, or create a workshop, or create an organization, or create an initiative, whatever it might be. It's a way of helping you as an artist push past that gallery conversation, push past that Q&A that is going to happen. That's like the first line of response that any audience is going to have.
So I'm just, thinking out loud here, but I'm imagining the way our crits work and how, as the artist, you're always present in the crit, right? It may be, depending on the instructor, that you're not allowed to talk until the end, or maybe you make a brief introduction and then you listen and then you respond at the end. Wouldn't it be interesting if you weren't there at all, so people could really talk freely, and then somebody took notes and summarized the feedback and gave it to you? That could be really interesting, right? I'm imagining a lot of, I'm looking at the students here, I know their work, and some of them are doing work that is socially engaged or dealing with, various kinds of issues related to, marginalization and injustice, politics of different kinds. In the front row, we have Andrea Campazano, and he did this piece in which he was a video of him standing on a beach looking out to sea, wrapped in a reflective blanket of the kind that are given to migrants from Middle East and Northern Africa when they first arrive on the shores of Europe, right? So I'm imagining if for that work, which is meant to be exhibited in a gallery context, that somebody who's wearing this role of impact producer might come up with a different name for it for this context. How might that work?
Yeah, so, I mean, this is a great example. In any case, artists do think like we can change the world, right? And we do want to change the world, and we do have an intuition for what the world of our dreams would look like. But we're a little bit discouraged from being ambitious by pragmatism. So in a case like if you're talking about immigration and borders and migration, human migration, I would ask, and you could have anybody do this. Anybody could be the impact producer, and it's just a dialogue. What's the set of questions? The set of questions is, well, what would you like to really achieve, right? And is it just immigration policy? Is it open?
What are they asking?
What's that?
Are they asking Andrea?
In this case, the artist. Yeah. In this case, with Freiband and Design, we're asking the boys because it was very much their work. In this case, if you ask the artist, well, what's the ultimate end goal? If you're completely in control of the situation, and be ambitious, like dream enormous. Open borders.
What's that?
Yeah.
Open borders.
Sure. Why not? Right. At the top end of Freiband and Design, is it prison abolition? It's like, why not actually set an extremely high standard? We might not get there in our lifetime, but that should be where we're aiming toward. And then the impact producer gets that goal, and then they're the strategists, they're the pragmatists about, well, who has agency over those issues? Like, is it politicians? Is it NGOs? Is it think tanks? Where does culture change take place? You start to think about, like, how do you put that book on the wall? And where do you want the effect to come out?
So you're saying maybe, I'm just trying to think really simply and practically. First level might be to try to get people who work in and on immigration issues to see the work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good place to start.
So exhibit it in the lobby of the World Bank. Maybe the World Bank isn't the right organization, but some organization that deals of ICE.
Yeah.
Immigration.
I always go the opposition. I think
Right. Another thing an impact producer might do is by working with an impact producer, Andre might say, I really shouldn't be making more work on this without actually spending time with immigrants and asking them what they want, right? So it might go in that direction. It might be like, Andrea, you should do this performance or show this video in a refugee camp, right? And then you might then observe how people respond to the work in the refugee camps, observe how immigration agents respond to the work. Do these, what do you call the sessions where you ask people what to respond? Like after the screening and
the talkbacks. Yeah.
So you do talkbacks,
Yeah.
then you bring this information back to Andrea, so that one impact it might have is to inspire new work, right?
Almost always. I think, so you're addressing the artist, right? And one of the things that you have to do, as you mentioned, is as artists, we have to first and foremost address our own biases, our own tendencies, and our own, it's like we all have them. We're all kind of emerging from structures that are outside of our control. And so so great. So if this is work about immigration, I won't keep picking on you. I'm singling you out, but if you're doing work about immigration,
That was me.
Okay, yeah, that's not hard. But if you're doing work in immigration, that's why I ask, well, what do you know and how do you know it? Like, what do we know about immigration? Like, what is your experience of it? And that inquiry into what you know and how you know it is ultimately meant to get at your biases, right? It's ultimately meant to get at, well, do I need some first-hand information? I use models for kind of identifying. I think it's so important that artists are allowed to make work outside of their expertise. You don't have to inhabit that space to make work there. You just have to know that you're outside of your expertise.
I think a key concept here, and we have a workshop on art and research taught by Camila Janan-Rashid. So there's the kind of research that we do that informs our practice. So, I'm doing work about climate change and wilderness, and so I start reading and watching films, listening to podcasts about climate change and environmental justice and stuff like that. I try to inform myself so I know the context of my work. Or, Andrea, you may have what do you know about immigration? It's probably a lot from media, probably a lot from your own online research, and probably a lot from conversations with activists and organizers and other people. But then there's this other idea, which is a somewhat more radical move. You're saying that the process of then making the work is a kind of research, a kind of qualitative research that is producing knowledge. But it doesn't really, to me, it doesn't really work as research without that impact production part of the cycle that we generally don't do. We leave that up to the curators and the institutions to do for us. And what they measure is things like the size of the audience that comes through, or were they successful in raising grants for it, or were they successful in getting one of their trustees to acquire their work. It's not the kind of impact that we're generally most interested in.
Yeah, I mean, critique is a kind of like impact producing analysis of your process. And I think you might recognize critique. It's like the first time that you get outside of yourself and you're showing unfinished work. It's always that work kind of safety valve that this isn't done, this is a sketch, this is an iteration, and I'm getting critique on it so that I can make it better. This is kind of the same thing. Your process is what's kind of being evaluated. And in this long list of the biases that we as human beings are subject to, there's one called actor-observer bias, which is you as the actor in your own life, you make your decisions, and if I ask you why you made your decisions, you'll give me some answer. Like, why did you have toast for breakfast this morning? Well, it sounded good, and I had bread in the fridge. If there was an observer, like a kind of passive, present observer that follows you through your life, like a documentary filmmaker, for example, and then you ask them, why did this person have toast for breakfast? They'll give a different answer. They will have seen other things happen, right? They will have seen you spend money on pizza the day before so you couldn't buy eggs for breakfast the next morning, but you've forgotten about that as the actor. So the observer has a kind of privileged view on our own behavior. And I think that's an important thing for artists who are we get very in our own head. And that's an important place for us to be, and we should be allowed to stay there. And actually having a critical group, right? Having a critique group is one way of having that set of observers. But the more kind of present your observers can be, the more they'll know about why you're doing what you're doing, and they can help you see your own biases.
One problem with the kind of critique, the kind of group that we have here is that it's a jury of our peers, right? It's a bunch of art students and art faculty that we're getting feedback from. Where maybe the people we should really be getting feedback from are immigration agents or refugees, in addition to other artists, right? So one thing an impact producer could do, besides being that person who follows you around with a camera and has a somewhat more objective, perhaps, view of your work, could also then arrange other places for your work to be screened instead of just in a white cube on the 9th floor of an art school. Wouldn't it be interesting to get it out in front of these different eyeballs, to get it seen by different people, and to have different kinds of impacts?
And then let the work change as a result too, right? You don't have a finished product that you're going out into the world with, but you are what is participatory art making.
I'm just imagining, let's say that you could get a screening to a bunch of immigration agents, against a bunch of immigration police, right? That then could lead quite naturally to some kind of embedding with, immigration enforcement agents,
Yeah.
right? And so it goes to the next step, and then you end up, actually getting paid by them to make the work that criticizes them, possibly. It's a dream, but it's maybe possible. I mean, I don't know if this would be interesting for you, but I'm just sort of trying to fantasize about possibilities for everyone in this audience, even if you're making abstract paintings that express your opinions or views about yellow and purple.
But what I like about that is that the idea of going and trying to embed yourself in what you might perceive, I mean, if you're working in social engagement, politics, or anything like that, then there is your territory, and there is an implicit sense of enemy territory, right? There is an opposition. Artists have one of the greatest privileges artists have is a kind of social fluidity that you're really invited anywhere.
We can walk across the front line.
Yeah, you can go anywhere and be like, I'm an artist, you know, that, because this is where the fact that nobody knows what you do is valuable. They don't know how dangerous you can be. They don't know how friendly you can be. There's like, art is cool, you know, my kid does art. And so if you think about that oppositional mentality, like who's like the bad guy, that's probably where you should be because those are your biases. Right? That's where you should go because that's the great unknown to you. If you're a researcher and you're trying to learn about the world, you should be learning in the center of the scariest and most unfamiliar territory you can. And what happens is, if you trust in the artistic process, adjacency to you and adjacency to your process.
Being next door to you.
Yeah, being next to will have its effect, will have that brick wall effect, right? You don't have to go and advocate for your position and be like, you know, open borders, man. You just go there and make your work. You will learn from them too, which is like scary. We might not want that, right? But that's part of our, I believe, responsibility.
Okay. I think now is a good point to open it up to questions and comments and feedback from the audience.
I find the talk very interesting. I was also thinking, when you talk about instrumentalization, I was also thinking of the word urbanization, in the sense, like I come from Venezuela, and propaganda is very infused in that culture, and I'm wondering how also to think ethically about thinking of ourselves not only as artists but as creatives, and how creativity is really like a very has a lot of potential, but it's also very dangerous because it can also like open tools for, you know, like very dangerous people to like do dangerous things. So I was thinking, if in the curriculum that you have, how would you address the use of this creativity in a really like a socially positive way, if anything? Because I feel like if not, we might fall into the capitalistic individual system where like I use my attributes and then I'm successful by myself, but I'm not thinking in the impact that I have collectively.
Yeah, great question. So instrumentalization, organization, again, you'll all be, I hope, hopefully offered jobs probably in communications, because that's again what artists are known to do. Right? Unlikely.
Yeah, probably.
Not even like web design.
Yeah. That happens sometimes. Most of our students end up working in arts organizations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, maybe in communications, but
Arts organizations.
Arts organizations like museums and galleries and other kinds of nonprofits. It doesn't seem like a lot of them, in my experience, go into advertising, marketing.
I would argue that an arts organization, that a museum is a communications.
Great.
Yeah, like that's communicating. It's just not PR. You know, it's its own kind of PR. It's cultural. It's public facing, right? It's public facing communication. So in some form, we are going to be invited to be instrumentalized in that way, either by making our own work or on behalf of other artists. So I worked in TV for a long time, right? And including long stints in reality TV, because in the 90s and early 2000s, that's what there was to do if you're a filmmaker or a camera operator. You work in TV, and the jobs were in reality TV. And I remember the whole dialogue around that was like, you know, this is a compromise that we're making to make like chintzy trash for, you know, some like kind of concept of the general public. But it's benign. I no longer think it's benign. I feel like it's complicity.
It's not harmful, at least.
Yeah, it's not harmful. It's not maybe the high culture we want to make. So I didn't even think I was making propaganda. I didn't think I was filming anything that had like was a real social threat. I didn't ever actually work on The Apprentice, but I was offered that job. And I know people who worked on that show, and it's a very complicated
It
position.
was Donald Trump's show.
Donald Trump show. So they created it, right? Television, media, communicators, artists created that. We are culture producers. So even when we're not doing propaganda, we're doing propaganda, right? Because we produce culture. That's where this sense of responsibility comes from. Like, it's an enormous responsibility. Even when you're making a compromise for a sustainable life, right? It's not even coming up to the point of what you're describing, which is like being weaponized to actually make posters, make propaganda, advocate for the bad guys. I recorded sound in the real world, and I feel like I'm complicit in the rise of fascism in America. It's like, I think there's a direct line, and I think that's
The Real World was an MTV show in which they embedded surveillance in houses where a bunch of young people would live together and have various kinds of social drama.
Yeah.
And you felt like that basically gave governments or corporations permission to put cameras everywhere and surveil us, which contributes to the rise of fascism. Just trying to unpack what you said.
Yeah. Harmless fun, young people in a loft, and the manifestation of Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes, and now reality TV is what we have, and it's contributing to our oppression.
There's a great book on reality TV as surveillance by Mark Andreevic.
Yeah.
Totally worth reading. Let's move on to, what I'd like to do is ask for a volunteer from the audience, a second-year student who thinks maybe this isn't relevant to them, and then we can maybe just brainstorm a little bit how it might be. Can I have a volunteer, a second-year student who's willing to engage in a dialogue?
I don't know if I'm not agree, but I have doubt of what we're speaking about. So starting from the beginning of the presentation, I remember there was the bubbles. And each bubble was connecting both directions, but not the one between art, text, and audience. So this and this was connected just in the direction from artist to audience.
Right.
But I think that now is not true. It's not anymore true, because I think like, not everyone, but a big percentage of the artwork is based directly on audience. I think mostly of the creative process is thinking before about the audience than the work itself. And so I think like it can be a direct relation between audience and art, skipping the process. So the process that comes after the audience touch the artist, and then the process of realization of that.
Were you guys able to hear Andrea's comment? Let me try to summarize. So you're saying that in the diagram that showed art and audience, there was an arrow going from art to audience, but it was one direction. And Andrea was saying that in contemporary art practice, we sometimes are just thinking about the audience as we make it. Other times, the audience, in a certain sense, participates in the making of the work. So there isn't really the separation that the diagram implied between the artist text and the audience text. Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
And
You want
yes.
the mic?
No, not necessary. And I can speak loud, everyone can listen to me. So, and I think that it's not about like, so I don't believe that art can change something, but I think that it can be very creative and not just subject to create from the outside world or from something that can criticize the art itself. So my question about this is like, how, like the question is the art more effective in the reality, or is more like a very good witness of the reality? And so going on with the timeline, in which is it?
So art is a form of not trying to change reality, but as a form of critique and witness.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I have an anecdote which kind of sheds light on your proposition. I was interviewing a poet, a beat poet, Hetty Jones, very important writer, who's done a lot of work in activism. And she she and her first husband, Amir Baraka, created this magazine when they were in their 20s called You Get It. And this is before digital everything. So Hetty was there cutting stuff up on literally cutting, text out to scotch tape onto pieces of paper to lay out the poetry journal. They did like 5 copies and five editions of the magazine. And she thinks that maybe 3 or 4 people bought it, their friends. And now, cut forward 50 years, 55 years, is one of the most important poetry journals recognized historically. I mean, the idea of that ripple is real, but you don't know the time scale on which it will occur. That is unknowable.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. I don't think the art makes the change, in that sense. And that's kind of what I mean, like when I say, documentary isn't an economically, valuable thing by itself without contextualization, putting it into the world in the right place at the right time with the right dialogue built around it. It doesn't do anything by itself. So that's why I think that the artist it's the artist that actually does affect some form of change, or the audience, right? So you can show work to somebody and they might take it with them, and I feel like, like the sensibility of doing a poetry magazine that 4 people might see, anyone who's ever like played a music show or been to a music show and there's only 6 people in the audience, there's this, on the one hand, like the sense of futility. Why are we doing this? What's the point? And yet we do it anyway. And when that ripple effect, when like 50 years go by, and all of a sudden this is important, right? People see it as important. It wasn't the poetry that made it important. It was the audience, the rippling, and then the artist staying with it. I think that's a piece of it. It's like the artist not making a piece of work and then kind of letting that go out to the world and expecting it to do any work by itself. Like, it's the artists that have the value, right? It's not what we make. And I think that addresses it, but I think that's kind of the ethos of this. And yes, like the arrow between the audience and the artist, or the audience and the art, goes through our process. And I feel like even if that process is almost instantaneous, where you're like making participatory art, like some thought process got you there, right? It's not entirely spontaneous. And so your process might be very, very short and quick, and you come up with ideas really immediately, and you've got them going in the gallery or in the social practice the next day. Or it might take years. So there's varying degrees of how much text we have to work with if we're trying to figure out what is your literacy. How do you know what you know, or what do you know and how do you know?
Do you think that there are artistic practices for which this is not relevant?
Probably. I don't know. I don't know every artistic practice, I will say this last group that I worked with, there were 3 dancers, a musician, an artist that identified herself as a social practice artist, sculptor. And I've worked with filmmakers, and I've worked with sculptors and textile artists, and photographers. So far, every artist knows things. So to that extent.
I'm gonna, Mike, do I have permission? Can I have your permission to engage you a little bit on this?
Yes, if you want.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm picking you just because I can see you, and like line of sight, and I like and respect your work a lot. Mike is a painter who's making kind of sculptural objects with paint. Tiny, tiny little accumulations of pigment that often are positioned on the end of, like in the work that I saw at least last spring, like on the end of sticks and things like this. We would describe it in the range of practices from socially engaged to purely aesthetic and formal, more on the end of the purely aesthetic and formal, I think, right? And yet I remember talking with you when you applied and trying to get a sense of like why you make what you make and what motivates you. Do you remember what you said? Yeah, I think it had to do with kind of spirituality and almost like a kind of therapeutic, not like art therapy, but that there's something almost healing in like your intention has to do with something that's, I think, spiritual healing to some extent. I mean, I kind of feel that in your work. I mean, not to like reduce it to that. Does that, I mean, do you see any possibility in, or any interest in your work, for example, finding context outside of art galleries and museums?
I mean, I guess not really. I mean, I see an engagement with the audience that I've been thinking about lately, but yeah, not really outside of those topics.
Would you be interested in having, I'm just trying to, like, I'm picking Mike because it's kind of like a border case for the relevance of this. Any interest in, for example, somebody being like an impact producer to look at how your work is affecting people and how they're responding to it, and then to have that come back to you to inform your thought process?
Yeah.
I mean, we had a conversation about this, right? That was also just a little bit around the last time we talked, like, where is it not relevant? And I will say my biases, it's like, I have a great group of advisors that have been kind of helping shape this thinking. I definitely tend to the like kind of rigorous structural sort of data-y, like let's like pin something down and nail it. And then there are people who are talking about, well, it's like the whole point of this was supposed to be opening up space for concepts like the soul and concepts like belief and happiness and emotion, like the human things that are ineffable. And so a part of that for whether it's painters who have like a kind of more internal, inward-facing process, there's something there taking place that is valuable and essential and doesn't have, I'm concerned, doesn't have like an economic or a social place. And so you can do socially engaged work that is entirely inward-facing.
But if it reminds us of our humanity, it reminds us of our connection to one another. That may be without economic basis, but with great social purpose.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm a huge believer in that, right? And I think that's why, like, if you're looking at artists' literacies, right? Those literacies are sometimes going to be extremely poetic, extremely soulful, extremely intangible, and I want to insist. I mean, my role is to sort of insist on those things as forms of data in a society that only values data, right?
Maybe we can make our target society that doesn't value.
Yeah, exactly. That's the end goal, right? When this thing lives and dies, that's where I want to be, right? We're in a place where I don't have to exist. We don't need to translate art and the ineffable for people who only recognize deliverables, economic output, and
And commodities.
And commodities.
Could be this impact producer, right? Also measure, I don't know if you consider this yet, measure also the risks of specific artwork. For example, artists that are implied without their desire in gentrification process, for example. This could be also something for this, because I think I want to have this service for me, but it's also the risks of a work, your works awesome, but there is a risk that it will impact badly for the community this way.
Yes, so you mean the risks of making work kind of maybe blindly or being unaware?
Yes.
Yes.
Unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So that I think is, that's a part of it when I was talking about like what our biases might be, right? You know, as a maker, you're going to have biases, you're going to have blind spots, and unless you open your process up to a kind of friendly, helpful observer, then you have a risk of kind of blundering into a space that you didn't mean to blunder into. And so that's one of the it can also be kind of like having a therapist, right? That's just like, are you sure you want to go there? Like, here's the implications of going there. You know, it's like, is this a great choice for you? But always meant to make sure that your work is engaging in its context in the way you intend it to, right? Not just kind of like, well.
I'm just wondering where else you showed your prison film.
So, so we showed it in, let's see, all over the place. We were very fortunate it aired nationally on PBS, so it had broadcast. During that broadcast, we tried to have a campaign where the film, it was broadcast on PBS, which we had aimed for.
PBS is the American Public Television Network. Yeah, so it's funded partly by the government and partly by corporate sponsors, but it's a little bit less commercial than the mainstream networks.
And in prisons, you don't get cable, but you do get PBS. In order to have incarcerated populations see the film, PBS was going to be the only really viable option. So when it was broadcast, we had simultaneous kind of viewings in prisons and outside of prisons with community groups, family groups, people who are affected by these things. We showed it in a juvenile correctional facility in the Bay Area, so kids who are also incarcerated and are simultaneously like the child in this experience and some of the parents in this experience. And then we showed it in classrooms, libraries for surrounding communities, and then law schools. So this is the other avenue. Who is driving prosecution, and what's the engine of the criminal justice system in America? Prosecutors and judges. We showed at the judges conference and had a workshop for judges so that they recognize when they sentence someone that they aren't just sentencing one person, but they're sending a whole family through this process.
Did you work with like prison reform organizations?
Yeah, a lot of them here, and in fact we did that here. We did it also in Europe and the UK and in Greece when the film was traveling for festivals. So this is the other thing. So the commodity market for documentary films is on a film festival circuit. Every film festival screening, we paired it with community screenings or educational screenings or prison facility screenings, so that the film festival circuit became entwined with these are the worlds where the film was going to be.
Okay, well, one last question, I guess. Two, maybe. We are going longer than usual, but
I'm curious, is there an application process? How do you select artists to come work with you? Is it a nomination based? Do they have to sign a contract to work with you? Kind of what's the logistics of being involved?
I wish it was that formal. So over the summer I did the first of these small work groups, and I'm really testing out even my capacity to do it. My intention is to have there be no hurdle for artists to participate. So in the work group, it was free, or you just signed up. I took as many people as I could in the first group, and it's like a 6-week commitment. We met once a week for 2 or 3 hours, and the only commitment was like it only really helps if you come the whole time.
that sounds like a workshop. I mean, we have these workshops that are 7 weeks, 2 hours a week.
Yeah, that's and then I'll do a follow-up, and each of those artists, what I would like to have happen is after those artists go through it, they're like, oh yeah, I get a sense of how this works, and their practice evolves a little bit, and I stay connected to them, and then I'm looking for opportunities for them, so I'm trying to also stay connected to organizations that have problems to solve or have systems to study. And I might say, hey, I had an artist who would be perfect to fit into that, and if I can cultivate those relationships. So it's just sign up, it's free, or barter, trade, service, you know. So one person paid $100, it was super sweet, one person brought croissants, and that was good. I was talking about, you know, everyone's asking me, like, you're starting a business, what's the sustainability model? And that's when I finally realized, like, well, there isn't one. It's just going to flame out eventually. But
Either that or it'll snowball and live beyond you.
yeah, but in the meantime, it's the organizations and the institutions. So I turn around, I leave the art school, and I am now a consultant, and I provide consulting services using unique types of qualitative data. And I know it works because I've seen it work. And so that's like how I become this kind of translator. The consulting would bring money to the artist resident, and the Literacies Institute is like, stop, you know, like I've got this residency, and I want to do research in it, and that's where you know, we can like draw commissions from those kinds of opportunities.
Maria?
You were wondering if you found it relevant? I'm like an abstract painter, but I have a system for painting, and like I told people here that for me it's like food. So I know if I could set up like a set of instructions and share it with people, like listeners or anything. Like I know it works for healing, for whatever. So I do think it's relevant for us, even like my work might not seem useful outside the gallery, but I do think the process is, so that's pretty relevant.
Did you guys hear that? No? Yeah, so Maria says, is it relevant for me? I'm an abstract painter, but I have a kind of formula or system for making my paintings. And that other people could use that system for creating paintings, and that process of following that system is somehow healing or therapeutic. And so she might be interested in going through this process or applying this sort of way of thinking to her practice. Just to summarize, and I know that it's now almost 8:30, my sense is this way of thinking, which is similar, I think, to what a bunch of other people on our faculty are teaching in different ways and with different terms. People like Sharon Loudon and Matthew Delegate and others. Almost certainly relevant to about a third of you, maybe, probably to about a third of you, and probably not for another third of you, something like that. I don't know what the exact percentages are. But you know, when we're thinking about how do you make your life as an artist for the rest of your life after school, what combinations of things do you do to pay the rent and maybe eventually the mortgage on your home, and do work that you find fulfilling and relevant that synergizes with your artistic practice, or maybe to take your artistic practice eventually outside the walls of the galleries and institutions where you want to be invited, right? But then maybe also you want to go further. And I think this is a framework for thinking that through, so that you could possibly have ways of working that also produce the work. You know, so it's not just an opportunity to go embed yourself in a homeless shelter or in a refugee camp or in a police department, but also to have that then feed the work, right? So that the new work that you could never really imagine gets made, and that it has impacts way beyond the art world. So Maud today presented on forensic architecture, and you know, this is engineers and architects and scientists, and you know, software engineers and people like this that are trying to look at, to investigate investigations is what they call it. And many of them, most of them, don't think of themselves as artists, although their work is often included in places like the Whitney Biennial and shortlisted for the Turner Prize. They're at best ambivalent about being considered artists, because at some level, when you put it in an art institution, it gets de-instrumentalized and turned into an object of consumption, an experience that could be seen as a kind of high form of entertainment. and maybe disempowered in a way, or made sort of less politically efficacious. Because what they're often doing is working for a client to try to change an outcome.
Yeah, I mean, they make work that becomes evidence in legal cases, you know, under migrant.
Right, but I think it doesn't necessarily, I mean, I think what they do is amazing, but you don't have to do that in order to have impacts outside the art world. You could even be making delicate little sculptures made out of pigment and tree branches.
Another way of having impact is also, like what I'm saying, you say no to things.
Right.
You know,
Like architecture did by pulling out of by India.
yeah, and what Jenny Odell calls, you know,
So that's one case where they were pulling out was rejected.
yeah,
Right.
just saying no, you know, like Jenny Odell calls resisting in place. And, you know, to circle back to like the weaponization question, you know, to the extent, like the extraordinary power that the producers do wield, while at the same time being told that you are like the lowest of the low outside of the economic system. Saying no to a job can be very hard and requires you to kind of, you know, am I capable of it? What are the implications of doing it? But just valuing your presence there really, really highly. And, you know, it's like, are you being asked to do something that you feel like is contributing to the brick wall in the right way? Or is this another example of, you know, the market, commodity market kind of drawing you into it?
You will all, if you're lucky, have opportunities to say no in the near future, right? Jay, you know, you have this wonderful opportunity to have a solo show on Orchard Street next week, right? And are the conditions right for you? You know, I'm not asking you to respond right now, but you know, that's an opportunity. Like you're delivering value to them just as much as they're giving you an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
The one that I know you guys will all have is our upcoming thesis show, right? Those of you in the first year will, you know, have an opportunity to participate or not, right? And under what conditions, right? So, you know, opportunities, you have the opportunity to decide every day whether or not you continue with this program under the conditions that are offered.
Thank you.